So today, our conversation is around administration. And the reality is that on, on our webinar today, I know that we have both clergy persons and also laity, and some of our laity are persons who are serving in local churches, in administrative positions in church offices. Some are also leaders in churches. And so one of the things that we have to remember around administration is that clergy, we are appointed to order. Part of our responsibility and role in the local church is that we are responsible for helping to order the life of the church, which means that we are appointed to care for administration. And the reality for us is, I think that there are some who really love that, and there are some who really loathe that. But the reality is, this is something that is part of our responsibility. And the, um, the the other piece to remember is that the pastor doesn't have to do all of this work alone. The work that we're doing in administration is something that clergy and laity, we are able to partner together in doing this. And I cannot do my job as a pastor, as a district superintendent, without the help of capable laity. And so, pastors, you do not have to be responsible on your own to do all of the administrative work. However, pastors are the ones who are ultimately responsible. And that's an important piece, I think, for us to all remember, that ultimately the pastors are responsible. Now, one of the areas of administration that we have that we need to be caring for is the vital signs. So let me just talk through this with us. One of the questions that we need to wrestle with a little bit is, why is it that we want vital signs recorded? Now, these are the vital signs for our local congregations. So we're looking at measuring, keeping track of the numbers that are focused on worship attendance, participation in small groups, participation in missions, weekly offering, money given for mission support, and then also our numbers of professions of faith. And why do we want these numbers? We want them because the things that we value, those things that are important to us, we track, we measure, we count them. And our numbers around the numbers of people that are attending worship services, the numbers of professions of faith that we have received in the local church, that speaks to what we value, because we value people knowing Jesus. And so it's really important for us to track those numbers. It also helps us to follow trends. It helps us to know, really, is there a summer slump? Really, what happens when there are different impacts on the schedule? And it also helps us to be honest and pay attention to the numbers of people who are participating in various different opportunities to be part of the church. But it keeps us honest too, so that we can see, are we losing traction? Have we been losing particular types of people? Have we been losing families with children? All of that sort of information, it helps us to pay attention to. Now, one of the questions that we need to think through is, what is the frequency with which we want to actually input the information and track the vital signs? Uh, the there are some who input this information every week. An email comes to the pastor, and the emails can also be sent to other folks within the church. And that email comes on a weekly basis to remind us to input the information. And there are some folks who just kind of follow those links and put that information in then every week as we have it. There are others who put the information in less frequently, but so that you're actually able to use these numbers so that they make sense, so that they're helpful. I think that it's really important to input the information no less frequently, if possible, than monthly, so that at least during at the end of every month, you're able to look back and see where things stand for the calendar year. You can look at where you were in the year previously, the prior year for that particular month, and study your numbers. Now, the reality with our numbers is this. I know you know that the numbers don't tell everything about the vitality of a congregation. The numbers don't tell us all of the details about how lives are being transformed, or about how the church is engaging in the community or engaging in vital ministry. And so, one of the things that I would certainly encourage is that if there are opportunities to put some narrative of what it is that's happening in the life of the church that is speaking to the vitality of the church, that in Vital Signs, take advantage of opportunities to write the narrative in. There are some places right there in Vital Signs where you can tell some stories, you can engage in ministry, but you can also make notes as well. Is it a low Sunday in worship attendance because the weather is really bad? Is it a high number because there is a baptism, and in that family with a baptism there were a lot of additional family members who are present visiting in worship? So you can tell narrative about details of what's happening as far as impacts on your numbers, but also narrative around how the church is engaging in ministry and mission, how the church is being the church without um, counting heads, because there are more details to vitality. So please know that that's something that exists, and make sure that you include that type of information. Now, just a couple of pointers when it comes to making some of the head counts. When you are counting people for worship services, we want to make sure that we're counting people once. So let's say, for example, you have children who start in the worship service, and then after partway into the worship service, they leave for a children's church. And they're having an opportunity to engage in a worship experience, a learning experience that that coincides with the worship time, and is not your Sunday school class. count the children once who are participating, not both when they're in the worship service and also when they leave. It's the same for small groups. Count your people one time. And when you are counting attendance to include in your weekly numbers for worship services, you're counting your regular weekly services. So you're not counting Christmas Eve, you're not counting Ash Wednesday or other special services. So just make sure that those are the pieces that you are counting. Now, if there would be some additional questions that you would have around vital signs, or you would have some need to make sure that you have clarity on what you need to do, if you would please look to either the annual conference website or go to umc.org, you'll find there's more information on vital signs, helping you accurately count information, but also some more information about places where you might include narrative. So please keep those current. Now, the next piece that we want to talk about is how you make sure as pastor, as church leader, that you are both protecting the church and protecting yourself. So this is where we want to look at safe sanctuaries, clearances, and boundaries. So the policy in the annual conference is that for safe sanctuaries, we need to make sure that clergy, we are participating in a safe sanctuaries training, which includes refreshers at least every 5 years. And we might find that in order to keep ourselves as current as necessary, that we need to double check and engage in refreshers more frequently than 5 years. But at minimum, what we need are opportunities for participating in a safe sanctuaries training every 5 years. I do think it is a best practice, pastors, church leaders, every time it is time to roll out a church ministry with children, with youth, with vulnerable adults, that we have a bit of a refresher, reminding ourselves of what our policy is and what it includes. Reminding ourselves of the 2 adult rule, that the youngest the responsible adult can be is at least 5 years older than the oldest youth and child participants, that everybody has their clearances, whether they are clergy, staff, or laity volunteers, that there are also laws around mandated reporting. So I think that just before Vacation Bible School happens every summer, it makes sense to remind ourselves of what our policy and practices are, that before youth ministry, Sunday school classes kick off again for the start of the school year, that it's a good time to remind ourselves, before the youth go on a mission trip or a retreat, to remind ourselves of what our policies and practices are. You want to keep those in front of us. But the training that's required is every 5 years. And the other piece, pastors, to keep in mind is that when you complete a safe sanctuaries training, you receive a certificate indicating you have successfully completed that. And so what you will want to do is make sure you keep a copy of all of your certificates and see that a copy is in your district's office for your file, so that we have the paper trail of having participated in a training. Now, our clearances are required to be updated every 5 years as well. Um, there are requirements that are very specific for both clergy staff and then also for volunteers. So persons who are paid and persons who are unpaid have requirements with their clearances. Now, for any of us who were serving in churches in 2014, that was when the Pennsylvania state law changed, and many of us at that time needed to update our clearances at that time, and that was when we added, per the state, the FBI fingerprint check as well. And so here we are in 2019, and before this year comes to an end, that means that any of us who were around in 2014 having our clearances done at that time, they will be due again before the end of this year. So please make note of that, and that will be the same for all of the volunteers in our local churches, as well as the paid staff in our local churches. The conference website does have a very helpful link on the Safe Sanctuaries page, which spells out the process for securing each of the three pieces that are required for our clearances. Clergy and paid staff are required to have the criminal history, the child abuse, and the FBI fingerprints. Persons who are serving as volunteers need the criminal history and the child abuse, and any volunteers who have lived in Pennsylvania for 10 years or longer are able to fill out and have notarized the affidavit that exists on the conference website. So be aware, please, that all of that information is there and spelled out. We need to have those. We need to make sure that the originals have been seen by somebody in the district office if you are a pastor, and if you are on staff at a church or serving as a volunteer in the local church, the church office, the pastor, needs to see all of the original clearances and then make photocopies to put into files so that you have those. Now, on that, I want to loop back to Safe Sanctuaries quickly. On that same page on the conference website, where you found the information on how to order and care for receiving all of the clearances, there is also a Safe Sanctuary training. It's a refresher training that exists for us. And one of the pieces that, if you use that as a refresher training, that I just want to alert us to, is that the Safe Sanctuaries training that's offered through Track One on the conference website does not include the current state law changes regarding mandated reporting. So just keep that in mind when working through that information. The last piece that I wanted to make sure to note for us when it comes to protecting the church and you is our boundaries training. So the difference between the Safe Sanctuaries training and the boundaries training is that Safe Sanctuaries is our training specifically about children, youth, and vulnerable adults. And boundaries is our training around ourselves and other adults. So in the boundaries training, it is required that for those who are newly serving churches, so in first appointments and first churches, that the required boundaries course is to be taken within the first 6 months of the beginning of that appointment or that assignment. if you are in need of taking that required course, there will be one offered in September in the State College District, and there will be one offered in November in the Lewisburg District. So watch for that information. For pastors who are not in a first appointment or assignment and have already completed that required boundaries course, our clergy sexual ethics policy for the annual conference does indicate that all persons serving in churches, so all of our pastors and pastoral leaders, do need to participate in a refresher course every quadrennium. Now, that can happen online through Wesley Seminary, through the Lewis Center. There is an online option that is appropriate. It is also okay to participate in one of the courses that is offered throughout the annual conference. On the required boundaries course, go ahead and take that. And sometimes there are some other boundaries courses that are focused on specific topics. For example, we have one that focuses on cell phone, social media, and supervision. And so that would be an appropriate one to take as well. But it's so important that we make sure that we are participating in these ongoing trainings, because not only do they protect us, but they also protect the church. And we want to make sure that as pastors, as church leaders, that we are being faithful to everything that we can do to protect the people who are entrusted to our care, to protect children, youth, and vulnerable adults, and to make sure that we have done every act of due diligence to care for the needs that exist of protecting people. So please keep that in mind and keep that on your radar. Okay, so we've talked through vital signs. We've talked a little bit now about protecting the church and protecting you. The next thing that we have to talk through is our church conferences. So a couple of important things for us to note. First, the difference between a church conference and a charge conference. So a church conference is one where everyone who is a member of the church is eligible to vote. In a charge conference, those persons who are members of the church council, whatever it is that we call the church council, are those who are eligible to vote. So there's a difference between a church conference and a charge conference. So again, church is every member can vote. Charge conference is every member of the church council. So that's your ad council, your church council, your leadership team, however you call that group. Now, in order for a church or charge conference to be legal, it needs to be announced by two different forms. So that can be from the pulpit, from the weekly bulletin, from a local church publication, from the mail. So you can send it something in the mail. The other is that it needs to be announced at least 10 days in advance, including at least 2 Sundays. Also, the DS needs to approve the timing of the meeting, the agenda of the meeting, and assigns the presiding elder. And the other piece to make it legal is that in the announcement, excuse me, all of the agenda needs to be announced. Okay, so what I want to do is talk a little bit about the annual fall church conferences. So during the fall, every every church participates in an annual church conference in order to care for the annual business of the church. So, um, right now, all of the forms for this fall for church conference are on the conference website, and you can find that information. And so in order to make it legal, so what one does is once you receive the date and time and location of your church conference from your district superintendent or your district office, it is announced at least 10 days and 2 Sundays in advance of the date. You share that the agenda is the annual fall church conference. You don't need to name anything specific for the fall church conference, unless, and this is when you do need to make a different announcement, unless you have additional business. If you have additional business at your fall church conference, that needs to be announced in addition to having your regular meeting. And then what you'll want to be doing for the fall is make sure that any additional items are also approved by the district superintendent for the sake of this is an interesting question. You want to make sure that the agenda items are announced for the fall church conference. Now, a question has come in asking if it is permissible or proper form to announce a church conference on Facebook. At this point, that would not count as one of the two opportunities to make it legal. What you would want to do, you could certainly announce a on Facebook that you have a church conference, the time, the location, the agenda, those sorts of details. But because that does not have the opportunity to go to everyone, you'll want to make sure that you, in addition to Facebook, post in another place or communicate in another place so that you can get the announcement to everyone. So I would think that at this point, Facebook is probably a third place as opposed to one of the two. Now, if you are in your first year in an appointment and you are working on your church conference paperwork, a best practice is to go to last year's paperwork as your starting point for figuring out the information for this year's paperwork. That will be the same with all of your year-end reports as well, as your year-end reports arise come January and March. Okay, so a question came up about specific examples of additional business. So at your fall church conference, let's say you know that you also would like to have the church work on securing a loan. Church conference has to approve for the church to go into debt. And if you've done all of the groundwork that's necessary leading up to the church conference and all of the information has been communicated and folks know what's going on, but it's just the only piece that's outstanding is taking a vote on a loan. That's information that's above and beyond the fall church conference. So what you would do is announce that in addition to the regular fall business, that at your church conference you will also be taking action, voting on the church taking a loan for whatever the purpose of your loan is. The other types of information can be if you have property that you need to buy or sell, if you have, oh goodness, any changes that need to happen immediately in your nominations. So the nominations report that you're voting on is for the next calendar year. If you have a nominations matter, a position that needs to be filled immediately that requires a church conference vote, you would want to take care of that at that time, but make sure that you've announced that you are voting on the regular church conference fall business, and also the nominations report for replacing, for example, the church treasurer, which would take effect immediately upon the election. So those are some things that might be additional agenda items, and you would just name what they are. But if they are items that really require the church to have information in order to make the best possible decision, you may really want to weigh the pros and cons of having a separate meeting, or also having that information happen or having that information I'm sorry. So I want to try and keep on top of questions with you as they're coming in on topic. And I know that questions have come in from previous topics, and we will loop back and pick those up. But as you have questions that are arising around current topics, I want to make sure that we're addressing them. So somebody's asked the question if a line of credit is considered a loan. A line of credit is something that puts the church into debt, and anytime the church takes a debt, because that's something that you're repaying to the bank, anytime that the church does that, you do need to have approval for that. So that's something upon which you'd want to make sure that you have a conversation with the district superintendent to schedule a church conference to vote on that. Now, what I was saying was, if you have additional agenda items for the fall that have like complications to them or might require a lot of information or a lot of conversation, you'll want to have a conversation with your district superintendent to make sure that you have put that information before the people in a way that they can responsibly answer. And the other piece is that you have the option to work with the district superintendent to schedule that at a separate time. Now, I've received a reminder that candidates for ministry do need to be voted on at a charge conference. That is something that we do need to also do, and that is part of the regular business of a church conference. That's one of the regular agenda items. But one of the things that is really exciting is in the life of the church is being able to vote on candidates for ministry, and the opportunity to raise up candidates and to affirm and support them. And so that would be a compelling reason to encourage folks. So as a part of the business of the Fall Church Conference, that if you have a candidate for ministry that that your church will be voting on, I would certainly highlight that, because that is something worth celebrating in many ways. So that's something as well, just to keep on your radar. Now, the best practice of using last year's paperwork to help as a starting point for this year's paperwork, what I would suggest is that if you are unable to find in your church a copy of last year's paperwork, contact your district office. The district administrative assistants will have copies of last year's paperwork, and they are all more than happy to be helpful and to share with you some of the information that they have. The other piece of information that I would share with you is that if this is your very first time filling out church conference paperwork, I would recommend having some conversation with your mentor, with your administrative assistant in the local church, with your administrative assistant in the district office, to receive some pointers on how to fill out the forms and the information. So if you have questions, there are people who will help. Now, one of the things that's important to do is to make sure that you give yourself enough time to complete all of the paperwork so that it can be submitted to the district office 2 weeks prior to your appointment, to the date of your church conference. So if I were serving in the local church right now, I would be working with the Committee on Nominations and Lay Leadership to be working through who are the persons who need to be serving in different leadership capacities, administrative capacities in the local church. I would be working on that now so that there's plenty of time and that we're not just frantically trying to plug holes prior to the deadline of submitting paperwork. I would right now have scheduled the meeting with the staff parish so that we can talk about what the salary needs to be for the clergy staff. I would be giving copies of the lay servant form to my lay servants to be filling out so that they have time to fill those out and return them to me so that I can submit them. So I would start working even this summer on organizing the paperwork, on organizing the people, and on scheduling the meetings that are necessary to make sure that I have everything submitted 2 weeks prior to the date of my church conference to my district office so that everything is in order and ready to go. And then when it's time for your church conference, remember to make a copy of anything that your church members need to vote on for the meeting. There are papers that we fill out, forms that we fill out that don't require voting but have important information. You may want to make sure that copies of those are also available, but at the minimum, anything that requires action from the church, please make sure that you have a copy of that for your members to look at. Okay, so next what I want for us to do is talk a little bit about the Book of Discipline. Now, I don't know about you, but I find I get a little bit twitchy when I don't know where my Book of Discipline is. If I leave it behind someplace, if I've lost it under the seat of my car, if really when I've left it behind in a church, I get a little bit nervous because I have not fully realized how much information there is in this Book of Discipline that helps us to organize everything that we need for life in the local church. So one of the first things that I would say to you is that there are so many answers in the Book of Discipline, and I'd encourage you to take authority. Many times I receive questions about various matters, how to handle some situations like buying or selling property, information about how committees are made up, who needs to be on what committee, how folks need to be elected or not elected, and that information is all in the Book of Discipline. So one of the things that I would recommend is to take authority and to do a deep dive into your discipline to look and see if you can find some of those answers. And then as you find them, if you have questions, certainly reach out to your district superintendent, to your assisting elder, to your mentor, to a colleague to see if they can find the information or help interpret alongside of you the information. Now, I want to be clear, the bishop is the interpreter of the discipline for us. So if there is something that truly needs interpreted, we need to take that to Bishop Park. However, sometimes the interpretations that we do are, these are the steps that I'm reading that need to happen. Does this seem right? Did I miss anything? The other piece that I just feel like we need to name with our books of discipline is this. The reality is there is an index in the back of the discipline, and the index may not be the most helpful index. There are some things that are easy to find and other things that make me believe that the index is really very challenging to navigate. And so for me, one of my best practices is that in the back of my discipline, I write my own index and write down the paragraphs of information that I am trying to find, that I have to hunt for on a regular basis, that I've tried to find and there's no way I can find in the index. So just feel free to even do some of that note capturing for yourself, and make sure then that you're using the discipline in a way that is helpful for you. Now, if we were to take a stroll through the Book of Discipline, there are some sections that are really helpful that I want to make sure we have on our radar. First, in the early 100s, so like from paragraph 101 to 110, the discipline has our doctrinal standards, we get our theological task, our general rules, and these are important because they set our foundation. This is what sets our theological foundation before we get into the polity of how we order ourselves as the church. And then from there, we go a few paragraphs later to the section of the ministry of all Christians. And this is a really important section because it lays out the mission and purpose of the church. And our mission of as the church is that we are to be disciples who make disciples. We also have in this section lots of information about what it looks like for the ministry of all Christians, that the local church is the best place for making disciples and our role in that. So that's an area of the discipline that I think that we underuse as well. Then after that, in the 200s, we get into the organization and administration of the local church, where we have church detail after church detail, which helps us with our organizing ourselves as the church and organizing what we need, like for our church conferences. So, for example, paragraph 230 talks about membership records and how we manage those membership records. Paragraph 246 talks about the charge conference and different things that need to happen in our charge conference. Paragraph 252 talks about the makeup of the church council. Paragraph 258.2 talks about the makeup of our staff parish relations committees, as well as the job description of that committee. Also, in this section in the 200s, we have information on lay servant ministries. When we get to paragraph 340, we have the responsibilities and duties of elders and licensed local pastors. So pastors, this is kind of a rough sketch of a job description for us. Later in the discipline, paragraph 2501 begins a conversation around church property and the trust clause. And then paragraph 2525 talks about local church property, including our local church board of trustees, a permanent endowment committee, buying, leasing, selling property, church debt, church mergers, closing churches. So all of that information is spelled out in our discipline. And I would encourage you, as different topics would arise in our life together in the local church, that you look into these sections to help be a guide for sorting out what steps we need to take and what information we need to know and what we need to have. Now, the last section that I am to cover in our time together before we get to a moment of answering our unanswered questions is to talk about when to call the district superintendent. So I can't speak for all of my district superintendent colleagues, but I do think it's safe to say that we don't like surprises. So if there is something that's going on, let us know. Reach out to the DS, and depending on what it is that's happening, reaching out to the DS may not be a phone call. It might be an email that just spells out a situation. So I might receive an email that says, "Hey, Kathy, I just want to give you a heads up on a conversation that I had," or "I want to give you a heads up on a situation that happened in the church." Also, I like to be notified if a pastor anticipates that someone from the church is going to call me, write me, if there's going to be a concern or a complaint or some kind of a concern that's going to come up. Let me know what's happening. And then when it comes to laity in the church, when to call the district superintendent, if there is a concern around the pastor that is not a formal complaint, one of the chargeable offenses per the Book of Discipline, what the district superintendent will say first is, if there is a concern about the pastor or staff, then my first question will be, have you taken this to the pastor, to the staff person, to the staff parish committee? That's where that needs to go. But if there is something that that would even be beyond kind of the scope of that, as a layperson, when you want to touch base with the DS, So for example, if your pastor is graduating from their schoolwork and you are having a celebration, send an email, certainly reach out. That's certainly an appropriate time to contact the DS. But it's so important to make sure first that we are going through the staff parish committee before going to the district superintendent. The clergy, make sure if you're anticipating that there's a concern, that you make sure that your district superintendent knows. I also think it's really important to make sure that you contact the district superintendent if you have to make a report as a mandated reporter, or if you are filing a police report, make sure that you've looped in the district superintendent. If there's something that happens and the media calls you and wants for you to make a statement, contact the district superintendent first, and also contact the conference office and speak with Sean Gilgore in the communications wing, because we want for communications to be speaking on behalf of our churches so that we aren't. Now, the exception to that is if you're doing something like hosting an event and the media is helping to promote it and they've come by to do that, that's a different kind of scenario. And so, by all means, but if the media is following a story or trying to capture something that may have some real challenges to it, definitely contact the DS. If there's a catastrophic incident, contact the DS. And then the other thing that I think about so frequently when it comes to contacting the district superintendent is that I want for pastors to contact me if there's something you need and I can help. We are a connectional people, and we are not, any of us, in this alone. And so if there is a need that exists, if there is a resource that we need to make a connection to, if there's a way that we can be working together, then by all means, please contact the district superintendent so that we can partner with you in ministry and sort things out together and also be a place of support. I think that's an avenue of contacting the DS that we probably don't take advantage of enough. And pastors, what I would say to you is this: each district superintendent has their own preferences and how to be contacted. So if you don't know the preferences of your district superintendent, then certainly reach out and ask your DS how he or she appreciates hearing from you. I know that some have a preference of send an email first or send a text message if there's some urgency. I certainly don't mind, pastors, that you call my cell phone, but I also do offer the word of caution that when you call, for example, my office, I am out of the office frequently in meetings, and so sometimes there could be days in between when I receive a message. And so, just when you think about what the need is and you think about the timeliness of being in touch with the DS, you might also want to be thinking about the modes through which we might contact the DS. So, okay, we've got those topics covered. And what I'd like to do is circle back now and look at the questions that are still existing. So I have a couple that we've not yet answered that circle back to previous. Okay, that's previous topics. So a question was asked about boundaries. Are we talking about any new laity and pastor who has not served in the church before? And if it includes cell phone use and social media use, shouldn't everyone take boundaries? So those persons who are required to take a boundaries course are those who serve as clergy, those who serve as CLMs, and those who serve as DS hires. So it's our pastors and those who fill the roles of pastoral leaders who are absolutely required to participate in our boundaries training. And the truth is, I do think there's a benefit for all persons to be looped in to appropriate boundaries. There are some resources that Joy Melton has put together that talk through things like cell phone use and social media use that I would recommend as a resource for every church to use. Now, there's another question around vital signs. Do we count ourselves in weekly worship numbers? And do we count the paid pianist who is not a member? Yes, absolutely. Count yourself, you're present, and also count, because what you're counting in attendance is everybody who's in worship, not only members. So it's the worship of everybody who is present. And so you do want to count everyone. Now, the initial course for safe sanctuaries, available online or only the refresher course. So here is my recommendation. On the conference website, through track 1, there is a safe sanctuary training. Because that is not specific to the state law and is not as current, I think that is best as a refresher, and that the initial course for safe sanctuaries be one that is offered through the conference, so that there can be an opportunity to discuss the questions that arise, the questions that exist. And so what I would recommend is reaching out to Jason Mackey for the most updated possibilities for safe sanctuaries, the initial training, so that is live. Okay, so that answers that. Okay, so in the chat, I want to see if I can find my way there. Because in the chat, there's some questions. Okay, so Frank, this is from you in the chat. You wrote that our church has youth and children choir they post on Facebook. Can you help me a little bit more with what you are specifically asking regarding that question? But then the next question, that the board, so around church conferences, that the church board has authority to fill empty positions. So at church conference in the fall, I think it makes a lot of sense when we approve our nominations to give authority to the church board to fill any positions that do not require a church conference approval. Those are the positions that a church council can fill. There is a list of positions that the discipline requires, be filled by a church conference or a charge conference. And so sometimes we find that the timing syncs up, that instead of having a special church or charge conference at some time during the year when there's a vacancy, that at the fall church conference, that's the right time to go ahead and approve those positions, for example. But there are some positions of leadership that the Book of Discipline says need to be voted on by a church or charge conference. And then there was a request for a picture of my own index. So my index has information on the administrative fair process and complaint procedures. Some of the information in my personal index are really some of those things that I deal with as a district superintendent. So they may not be helpful, but what might be helpful are some of those other paragraphs that I pointed out. So let me see. I understand we have a couple more questions that I'd like to look at for you. So for vital signs, how do you record a joint service between two churches? So what you can either do for that is do your best to roughly count how many of those present belong to which church and record them that way. Another option is to count and divide in half in total. Another option is if it is a joint service that happens infrequently, you may want to just post that information in one place, but not count that in your total number for the year. So instead of counting 52 Sundays, if it's just one Sunday that you have a joint service, instead of counting 52 Sundays, count 51 Sundays and exclude that number from your average. But the other thing to do is when you put the number in, whatever best number you choose for that joint service, you may in the note section want to capture a note that was a joint service and that's a best estimate for however many were there, or that's the total for the two churches, or however it is that you handle that. So this presentation will ultimately be captured in the video form for the website, the conference website, so that will exist. And what I can also do is send a copy of the PowerPoint notes, if that's helpful, to Amy Wynn in the conference office, and she can make sure that that information exists. Let me see, there was a request to look at screen 8. Is screen 8 the one that's up in front of you now? Okay, so that is posted there for you. Do church councils need to have safe sanctuary and boundaries training? No, that is not a requirement. However, I do think that it's really helpful for everyone in the local church who is in leadership to have an understanding of what your Safe Sanctuaries policy is, what your Safe Sanctuaries practices are, and how it is that as a church you are living into those to keep youth, children, and vulnerable adults safe. I do think that there are some helpful elements that come out of boundaries training for clergy that would be good for persons in church leadership to be aware of, but there is not a requirement for that training to happen. Okay, so a question about clearances. Do volunteers do need to have the child abuse and the criminal history clearance. The FBI, for volunteers, the FBI fingerprint clearance is required for any volunteer who was unable to sign the affidavit that exists on the conference website, or who has lived in Pennsylvania for less than 10 years. The volunteer affidavit is to take the place of the FBI fingerprint clearances only for those who can sign that with integrity and have it notarized, and also have lived in the state for 10 years or longer. Okay, so I think that we have gotten through our questions, and per the clock, we have also gone beyond our scheduled time of 1 hour. So if there aren't any other questions that are arising at this moment, then I'm going to express my appreciation for you all joining in the conversation today. And I know that it's a race through administrative details. If you have any questions that should surface by the time that we disconnect from one another, I do want to let you know that you may certainly email me with a follow-up question. My email is kind@susumc.org, and I am more than happy to clarify a little bit more. And I will send a copy of my PowerPoint to Amy, so if anybody needs that, we can access it. And I do understand that this, again, will be posted on the conference website in due order. All right, friends, thank you for joining me and taking this quick run through church administration questions and topics, and continue your learning and serve well. Have a good day.